Hello, Man in Gray here with another Man in Gray book review. Today's book is The Way Forward by Yung Pueblo, published in 2023 by Andrew McNeil Publishing. It's 234 pages long. Yung Pueblo is the pen name of Diego Perez, a writer who was born in Ecuador and who moved to the United States when he was 3. His books are a combination of instapoetry and self help or self improvement. So, before I talk about this book specifically, I want to take a minute and talk generally about the phenomenon of instapoetry. What is it, and what are the pluses and minuses of this form of poetry? Well, instapoetry is a general name given to poets who publish their work on social media platforms like Instagram or TikTok. And there is a lot of variety, as you would imagine, when you've got a whole bunch of people posting poetry online, but there are some general things they have in common. For one thing, insta poetry tends to be rather brief. Usually the poems are only 5 or 6 lines, sometimes a little bit more, but they tend to be rather short. They tend to have a very narrow range of subject matter. They tend to be a lot about relationships, about recovering from abuse or abusive relationships. There's a lot of self improvement, and there are a lot of poems that are kind of jokey, where there's a punchline at the end. So the phenomenon of instant poetry has really changed the nature of poetry reading. For years, the number of people who read poetry had declined steadily in the United States. But in the last 10 years or so, the number has steadily gone up. And a lot of that's due to insta poetry. Because there's a lot of people who read insta poetry who haven't read other kinds of poetry. Now, one of the reasons that poetry declined in popularity from like the mid 20th century until fairly recently is because modern poetry, contemporary poetry, developed a reputation that it was difficult and not accessible. And some of that's true. A lot of it was the unfortunate influence of T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot was a great poet, but he inspired a whole lot of horrible poetry. A lot of contemporary poetry of the 1950s and 60s was full of literary allusions and complicated references and often very narrow personal confessional type poetry that most people couldn't relate to. So this has changed with the phenomenon of insta poetry. It's become much more accessible to people who don't normally read poetry. Now, the opinion on insta poetry is kind of divided. It's a very polarizing subject matter. It's really come down into two camps. There are some people who really love insta poetry and who are very devoted to certain insta poets. In fact, there's a insta poet. His name I can't remember right now, but she's from Australia. And whenever she does readings in Asian countries, there are people who actually camp out overnight at the stadiums or auditoriums where she's giving poetry readings so that they can get in and get a ticket. Now, can you imagine people sleeping on a sidewalk to go see a poet? So that shows you something about the devotion that some people have to these insta poets. And like I said, one of the great things about insta poetry is it's encouraging people to read poetry who haven't in the past. It's kind of the way I feel about the Harry Potter books. Harry Potter books, are they great literature? No. Are there better children's fantasy authors than J.K. Rowling? Yes, there are. But the Potter books got a lot of kids interested in reading who wouldn't read otherwise. And the really phenomenal thing is reading long books. I mean, some of the Harry Potter books are 500 and 600 pages long. Who would believe that a 12-year-old would sit down and read a 500 or 600 page book? So the Harry Potter books did a lot to encourage kids to get interested in reading, and insta poetry has done the same thing for adults. It's gotten a lot of adults interested in poetry. Now, on the other end of the scale, there are people who really dismiss insta poetry as terrible. They say it's basically superficial. It's not even real poetry. There's no meter. There's no flow to it. It's just a bunch of journal entries that people jot down and then break up into lines to make it look like it's poetry. It doesn't really say anything. It's obvious. and so forth. And there's some legitimate criticism. Really bad Instapoetry is pretty awful. Now, I come down basically in the middle, as you might imagine. Some Instapoets are bad, some are really worth reading. And that brings us to Yung Pueblo, uh, Diego Rivera's book, The Way Forward. This is a pretty decent book. Um, it's not great poetry, but it's pretty good. And it does, like I said, combine insta poetry with self improvement, self help. It's kind of like a self help book that's been kind of broken down into little short sections. Now, you can tell when you read this book that Young Pueblo has put a lot of effort into this. One of the criticisms people have in poetry is that people don't work very hard at it. They just jot down a few lines and then voila, they post it. And they don't really think. A really exceptional poet is going to write a poem and then set it aside for a while and then come back and revise it, look over it again, make changes, and so forth. If you're just typing up something on a computer and hitting send, um, so maybe it'll be good, but a lot of times the poems could do with some improvement. Well, it's a revision. Well, Young Pueblo has spent a lot of time, you can tell, reading these poems uh, in arranging it. They are very well written. They follow a flow. There's a logical flow to what they're writing. It's not just typing something off the top of his head. And some of the poems are longer than usual Insta poems. Some of them are 2 or 3 pages long, the standard length for a kind of short poem. They're not just 2 or 3 lines that are dashed off. And the other thing, just from a presentation point of view, is just about every page in this book has text on it. If you get a lot of Insta poem books, and I'm not going to mention names, but there are some poets who are pretty notorious for publishing 250, 300 page books, but when you get them, there's like 4 or 5 lines on a page, and then the next page is blank, and then 2 or 3 pages over there's a photograph or a drawing. And so when you actually look at how much writing there is in a 300 page book, there's probably only about 100 pages. These books are obviously padded out because a lot of people, and with good reason, well, if you get a poetry book that's 100 pages long, a lot of the standard poets that publish today publish poetry collections that are 90, 100 pages long, and they're $25, $30 books. If they're hardcover, maybe even more. And there's a lot of people say, well, why would I want to pay $20 or $25 for a 100 page book? So the Insta poets publish these 200, 300 page books, but they only have about 100 pages of actual text in them. Well, that's not the case here. This book is over 200 pages, and it's almost all solid text. So you are getting your money's worth if that's important to you. So the book itself, the advice that Young Pueblo gives for people is pretty much standard self-help books. Believe in yourself, don't give up, keep trying, set goals for yourself, make sure the goals are something that you can work toward, make sure the goals are not vague. These are all standard self-help book cliches, you might say. I have no objection to the advice that Young Pueblo is giving here. It's decent advice, and it could help people. And the poems are pretty decently written. So if you are interested in dipping your toe in the world of Insta poetry, books by Young Pueblo or Diego Perez are a good place to start. His books are certainly better than a lot of the Insta poets that I've read. I do have the issue with all of these kinds that they're too narrowly focused. It would be good if some Insta poets would write a little bit more about things just beyond self-help and relationships. There are other topics, war, famine, global climate change, things like that you could write about. Families, nature. If you read standard poets. People like Donald Hall, Mary Oliver, Billy Collins, you get other topics besides just yourself, and there's nothing wrong with writing confessional poetry or poetry that's self-help, but a really good poet will branch out and do other material, right? Cover other things. But so anyway, to sum everything up, this book is a pretty decent example of Insta poetry. And if you haven't read any Insta poets before, Young Pueblo is a good place to start. If you have kind of contempt for that, you might try him. I think you might find his books more pleasing to you if you're a poetry lover than some of the other unnamed Insta poets. Anyway, that's the book. The book is called The Way Forward. The poet is Yung Pueblo, and this has been another Man in Gray book review. Thanks for watching.